How do you start a fire when the chips are down? You want to start a fire. It's cold, it's wet, you're outside, you need to eat, you need to stay warm. You need to start a fire. But this fire is in your heart. It may only be a shimmering ember right now, or a small flame at risk of being snuffed out by the winds of despair, depression, disappointment, anxiety, fear, or grief. You may feel you never even had that spark in your heart to begin with. But you want to start. You are willing to try. You want to start up that fire again, but you don't know how. What are you going to do? How do we start over? What is our first move on the journey of transformation? On a backcountry canoe camping trip, my fellow campers and I needed to get and keep a fire going, to cook our meals, to keep warm, and to provide the ambiance we all cherish around a campfire. But we did not haul enough wood in our canoes for 5 days. We needed to start a fire with what we could find on our island site smack dab in the middle of the large Cedar Lake in Algonquin Park. Now, when campers go looking for firewood, we normally look for hardwood branches, twigs, dry bark. We look on the ground near the campsite for fallen trees and branches. Some campers will even bring saws to cut down trees and chop the wood themselves. But that strategy was not going to work this time. August, as you may recall, at least in the east of Canada, was a wet month. Lots of soaking rain. So most of the wood and trees around us were waterlogged, literally. Moreover, it was a very popular spot with the beach. We were fortunate to get it, but that also meant there were precious little scraps of firewood left over in the immediate area around the site. But there was a kind of combustible material from the trees that was plentiful. It's called fatwood. Stumps from fallen trees covered the island, and some of those had roots, still drawing water from the ground up towards the top of the stump. The buildup of sap creates chunks of resin, and this resin burns like turpentine. When you burn fatwood, the fire crackles and pops and you don't get a whole lot of smoke. But the best of all, a small piece of fatwood burns for hours, longer than any other kind of firewood. It's perfect. Normally, we wouldn't look for dead stumps littering the forest floor to find the combustion we need. The fatwood does not look on the surface like good burning wood. It's ugly, dirty looking wood. Campers usually ignore it, discard it, don't even see it. But it was the best thing ever to start and keep our fire going. To start solving a problem, we first needed to realize the limits of our usual strategy. We first needed to confess that the way we normally have done things will not work in the present circumstances. The first step towards positive change in us is to admit we need to approach things differently at the start. The normal strategy won't work any longer, so don't even start with that. Where are we going to look then when we confess the old ways of doing things in our personal lives and in the church? These ways are no longer working very well. These can be attitudes, assumptions, beliefs, prejudices, behaviors. When the former strategies are not getting us anywhere, where are we going to look? The Gospel of Matthew can help. It was written to Jewish Christians who also had to start over. The Gospel was written at the end of the first century, right after Roman Emperor Vespasian completely destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. Those Jews who survived the brutal purge were demoralized and uncertain about how to move forward. There is no known equivalent to what Rome did that day, one scholar claims. The Jewish remnant escaped to Antioch in the north. Among them were the Messianic Jews who believed that the Messiah had already come in the person of Jesus, himself a Jew. What help does Matthew's gospel offer in a time of upheaval and dramatic change? Well, there are three clues. First, notice the tone of Jesus' teaching in the gospel. Several times in the gospel of Matthew, we hear this paradox from the mouth of Jesus, this tension between apparent opposites of loosening and binding, of losing and finding. It's not just in our gospel reading for today from Matthew chapter 16, but in at least three other places where we dance on the fulcrum of both and. Jesus seems to describe a life of faith in which we are always leaving something behind and starting something new, letting go of past strategies and learning new ones. It's admitting that there are times when I have to look elsewhere and not necessarily where I've looked before in order to face a challenge. Jesus says opposite kinds of things all the time, both comforting and challenging. Come to me, all ye that are weary and carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. That's comforting. But then right nearby he says, I have come not to bring peace, but a sword. This gospel, like no other, is full of paradox and seeming opposites. Why? To acknowledge the time of transition among first century Messianic Jews, from the pain of loss to the challenge of new beginnings. Then we see Jesus in action as he encounters people on his travels. He meets, for example, the Canaanite woman. She persists and is relentless against Jesus, who is rude to her and quite insulting. Because of the woman's courage to challenge a rabbi, Jesus grants her what she asked, the healing of her daughter. You can read that in Matthew 15, 21 to 28. The old strategy of reaching out only to Jews with the message of Christ needed to change. Our Lord Jesus himself models for us inner transformation, which is the starting point for our journey of faith towards healing and wholeness. The biggest help Matthew offers, however, is simply in the framing of the gospel, how it begins and how it ends. Matthew begins with the story of Jesus' birth. And Matthew is the only gospel of the four that includes the visit of the Magi. These wisdom seekers from the Far East were not Jews. They were Gentiles, using the language of the New Testament. And the story concludes with the famous words of Jesus, the great commission to his disciples to go to all the nations with the news of God's love and saving promise. All nations refers to the Gentiles. The term Gentile refers to people who were outside the pure Jewish religion. In the midst of a devastating loss, the Jewish Christians in Antioch were encouraged to engage and be with people outside their tradition. They were called to a journey that St. Paul would later pick up and emphasize. Read, for example, his letter to the Galatians. A journey to include Gentiles in God's loving embrace, making an ever-widening circle. Where do we look on the start of our journey of transformation when we admit old strategies no longer serve us well? The Gospel of Matthew suggests we look beyond the bounds of our own perception, attitudes, long-held assumptions, and beliefs, which at one point did serve us well, but currently are no longer workable. And those beliefs, which quite frankly will often blind us to what is right in front of us. The Gospel of Matthew, in modeling for us this shift, suggests we confess our biases and embrace a new path forward as yet untrodden. There's a holy part to this journey as well that yields the warmth, the radiance, and beauty of a good burning campfire. And we will discover that too along the way. That fat wood ain't pretty. Yet God calls us to this journey of transformation, not in spite of, but because of the unattractive, broken parts of our lives. There's something immeasurably valuable about fat wood. The journey will include all of it. Thanks be to God.